So one of the backer levels gets people the directed campaign, which is you are giving input to the GM about events in their individual Invisible Sun campaigns. How hands-on are you with that feedback?
Here's how the directed campaign is going to work. Once you start the directed campaign, you're going to get access to a website. And that website, in addition to having like forums and other sorts of ways that you can communicate with other people who are playing in the directed campaign, other people at MCG, whatnot, you can once a month get a download, and that download will have adventures and basically everything that you need to play for a month, right? And it's really best to think about that a minute, because I'm not talking about like a published adventure. I'm talking about more like how to set up a whole campaign, because those two things are actually pretty different. Adventures need to be so structured and so straightforward, right? You start at point A, you go to point B, and then you go to point C. Or maybe if it's really flexible, you go to point C and then you go to point B. But there's still a lot of direction. But when you think about the way a whole campaign goes, right, they're much more fluid, and it's not like you really can clearly see where one adventure begins and the other one ends and whatnot. So in fact, I'm actually trying to avoid in the actual game using the word adventure at all, because I don't think that it's actually a very apt way of looking, certainly at the things the characters do in Invisible Sun, but maybe really not what people do in adventures, right? They're much more sort of these ebbs and flows, and this happens, and if the characters do X, then they go to place Y, but if they don't do X, then they go off to something completely different and maybe never go to Y, or maybe they come back to Y 6 months later, right? That's kind of the way a more organic campaign goes. So that's how I see the directed campaign. So it's not so much that like I am specifically paying attention to what you are doing, and it's not like, I mean, it's not required that you like send in reports about what is going on in your campaign. It's not like that, but instead imagine it like this branching tree that we'll just have figured out all the various potential branches that are likely to happen in the course of the campaign, and then we'll just ask you pointed questions along the directed campaign. Did your characters decide to steal the magic crown, right? And if they did, then it will sort of trigger this whole other series of events, and so you'll go down that path. If they didn't, then you'll continue going on the path that you were, and maybe at some point again that will come up again, or maybe it will never come up again, and you'll continue to move down that particular path, because that's kind of how I see campaigns working. A lot of this will be just how you move through this already set up network of potential paths, and there'll be a lot of different potential things that we'll have to cover there. But because campaigns do kind of tend to fold back on themselves, and like the bad guy, to just use really simple ideas here, right? The bad guy that showed up in month 2, you might have the opportunity to go up against him again in month 8, and so it will fold back in on itself again. And I think that that's a good thing, right? That's interesting. It makes things seem more cohesive and more like a real world if something that happened 6 months ago is affecting you now. So that's how the directed campaign will kind of work. And so each month you'll get sort of all these different ideas of adventures and things to do, and everything will be fleshed out. You'll get NPC stats and maps and all the kinds of things that you'd normally need over the course of an adventure. but it'll also make a lot of assumptions, right? Because the way Invisible Sun works, there's always player based things and story arcs, right? So there will be an assumption that some of the play that you have in your campaign is going to be based on, well, someone has the revenge story arc also going, right? But not everyone is going to have that, and so what we'll do is we'll sort of insert places like, well, this would be a good point to focus in on a particular character's story arc that is personal to them, right? Either through a side scene or bring it to the fore at the table. That kind of guidance will be right there in the directed campaign, so it'll kind of it'll that's why it's the directed campaign, right? It's very hands-on. It's very, okay, do this and then do that, and then present them with this option and maybe integrate this thing here, that kind of thing. That's, much more sort of organic and fluid than I think we normally see with just sort of a prepackaged adventure. Of course, the directed campaign, in addition to being all this, adventure material, all the material you need for your year-long campaign, it's also filled with all kinds of player handouts and props, because I love that kind of thing, and I think it adds so much. And to the point where you'll also get some physical mailings, 4 different physical mailings over the course of the year that will have like actual 3D, objects, rings or amulets or whatever that come into play. And even your players will get, some kind of weird invitation or something like that, a letter from an NPC or something that just adds to that. So that's also a big part of the directed campaign.